time zones. So we, as a reminder, are going to have our first speaker, and throughout his presentation, he'll share a little bit about who he is before jumping into what I am very much looking forward to, a presentation on his work. If you have questions, please type them in the chat throughout the presentation. I'll be looking at that chat and will be direct messaging you to see if you're comfortable coming on in the question and answer to ask your question, or if you want me to read it out to you, for you. So please put your questions throughout the presentation in that chat. We'll have lots of time to discuss once the presentation is done. All right, you have heard enough from me. I am very, very excited to introduce and pass my virtual mic over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Dagomar Degroot, who is an associate professor of environmental history at Georgetown University. He is a superstar in environmental history. I think so anyway, and I think the field would agree, because many of the publications that I shared with you in Slack and in email earlier this week are pretty spectacular, and I highly recommend all of them. From the essay recently on the Arctic to the open access nature article that I also shared, but also if those are interested in a longer read, in his book, The Frigid Golden Age, which I personally found very inspiring as someone who had never read something in environmental history before that book. It was a really wonderful read and extremely educational. And I'm very much looking forward to his second book when it comes out. But I'm sure he will share more about that. So I'm going to hand over my virtual mic to Dr. Degroot, and he will take it away from here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Herman. Truly one of the people I admire and respect the most in climate scholarship. So it is such an honor actually to be joining you. And also one of the people that my students admire and respect the most. You've obviously come to my classes several times, so it's time I pay you back for that just a little bit. I can't, I'm not as good a public speaker as you are, but I can at least try. So hopefully that will be good enough for all of you. Yeah, so let me begin by sharing my PowerPoint. Can you all see that? Okay, awesome. Okay. So as Dr. Herman said, I am Associate Professor of Environmental History at Georgetown University, and a lot of my work bridges the sciences and humanities, in particular to explore how populations responded to environmental changes in the past, with an eye to gaining a better understanding about the future. Right? I tend to feel that if we learn from the past, we can maybe prepare better for the future. Although, of course, the challenges that we face today and that we will face in the future are different from those of the past, as we will see in this presentation. Let's see, other things about me. I too am preparing for the cicada outburst in several days. There's an article about cicada stir fry in the Washington Post that recently came out. I do not think I will be using that recipe, but still I'm preparing for that. But if you have any other questions about me or the kind of work I do, I'd be happy to answer those. But what I actually really want to do is introduce you to my major field, the main thing that I study, which is all about climate change and how past populations have dealt with it mostly over the last 1,000 years or so, or 1,500 years. And so in this presentation, I will describe for you what we know about climate changes over the last 2,000 years or so, how scholars have tried to connect those climate changes to human affairs, some of the problems that they've encountered in trying to do that, and then maybe a path forwards that focuses on more diverse responses, past responses to climate change than have been studied so far. And then maybe I'll get into some lessons as well that we can learn from the past. Okay, so let's get going. Many of you have probably seen visualizations like this one. This is a map that shows temperature anomalies since the end of the 19th century through right around the present, where bluer colors represent cooler temperatures, up to about 2 degrees Celsius cooler than the mid-20th century average. And redder colors represent hotter temperatures up to and beyond 2 degrees Celsius hotter than that average. Of course, as you can see, the Earth is warming rapidly and nowhere more than the Arctic, which is warming about 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth. So a visualization like this one is what we call a reconstruction of past climate change. Now, the first person to come up with a reconstruction, develop a reconstruction, was an astronomer named A.E. Douglas, who actually started his professional career by tracing canals on Mars. But he figured out that the width of rings in trees corresponded to changes in temperature and precipitation, because trees grew differently and therefore left rings in their trunks of different widths according to different temperatures or different precipitation. So he used tree rings to, for the first time, create climate reconstructions. And he called these tree rings proxies for climate change, stand-ins essentially for instrumental records of climate change. Well, this was in the early 20th century. And then a geographer came along called Ellsworth Huntington. You can see him on the right, looking very dapper, connected these reconstructions to human history by arguing that changes in temperature accounted for the rise and fall of past empires. And these ideas weren't taken particularly seriously at the time, but his methods and the kinds of sources that he used really laid the foundation, laid the groundwork for subsequent efforts to connect climate change to human affairs, to human history. All of those efforts have relied on reconstructions, and all of the reconstructions have in turn relied on 2 different kinds of archives: the archives of nature and the archives of society. The archives of nature are aspects of the natural world all around the Earth that changed when the climate changed. And by studying these aspects, these elements of the natural world, and really studying their composition, you can gain a sense of how climate has changed. So this is a map of 8 different popular kinds of proxy sources exhumed around the world using just National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration funding. So these are just 8 different kinds of proxies, but there are really dozens of them all over the Earth. And you can see those tree ring proxies. Since A.E. Douglas, they have become very, very common in areas where there are growing seasons, so in temperate latitudes, so not at the tropics so much. But you can also see white triangles at the poles mostly, and these represent where ice cores have been accessed. The ice sheets of the world can be thought of then as one of these natural archives. Right? And this is a good way of giving you a sense of how these proxy sources actually work for what's called paleoclimatologists, climatologists of the past. So they can be thought of as an archive because, of course, they accumulated gradually over time, over thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years. In Greenland, if you dig down, you can get up to about 150,000 years old. That's how old these ice sheets can get. In Antarctica, it can be about 3 million years old. So you dig down and you get these long cylinders. Those are called ice cores. And you can see a paleoclimatologist digging there on the left, which seems really cool to me. I wish I was there. I think this is in Antarctica. So if you zoom in on one of these ice cores here on the right, you can see a whole bunch of layers. Okay? And those layers tell paleoclimatologists 2 things. They can make 2 different kinds of reconstructions with them. One is a reconstruction that shows regional precipitation over a unit of time, up to about a year. So annual regional precipitation. The thicker the layer, the more it precipitated. So that allows you, again, to go back potentially millions of years, see how precipitation changed at the poles. But also, you can measure the ratio of heavy to light hydrogen or oxygen isotopes to gain a record of Earth's temperature. Because when the Earth is hot, heavier isotopes of oxygen or hydrogen evaporate and ultimately precipitate at the poles. So when there's more of these heavy isotopes in these layers, that means the Earth was hotter. So this is really a record of regional precipitation and global temperature. But also, and perhaps most importantly for all of us, these ice cores also contain tiny little bubbles of trapped air. And if you're very careful, you can sample these little time capsules and figure out what the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere was like, again, potentially millions of years ago. And it's partly through these bubbles that we know that the chemistry of the atmosphere today has no parallel in the entire history of our species. That's about 300,000 years, right? Obviously, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today have reached a concentration that they've never reached before, at least in the history of our species. So these proxy sources and these archives of nature have a remarkable amount of information to teach us and to tell us. Okay, so that's the archives of nature. Now, the archives of society are accessed by a different kind of scholar called historical climatologists. And these are just elements, I should say, some things created by human beings that tell us how climate has changed. So from archaeological ruins to oral histories, and especially documents. And maybe my favorite example of these archives of society are ship logbooks, which as Dr. Herman knows, I've used a lot, maybe too much in my writing. But that's because in the age of sail, sailors didn't know how to calculate their longitude with any kind of accuracy until about the late 18th century. And they used a technique called dead reckoning. This is some tools you can use for dead reckoning even today. Dead reckoning depends on knowing the velocity and the direction of the wind. So sailors would write down this information in logbooks. Again, for hundreds of years, they created thousands of these things. This is a logbook that I examined. It's from the early 17th century, and it was written in the Arctic. And so what you can do is you can take all this information about wind direction and velocity, quantify it, and then ultimately create reconstructions of what we call atmospheric circulation. So the movement of air across the Earth. And to give you a sense of the scale of this effort, these are individual data points in the climatological database of the world's oceans, which has hundreds of thousands of these data points from thousands of ship logbooks, and what we currently store at historicalclimatology.com. So this is also a huge effort. So you combine the archives of nature and the archives of society to create reconstructions like this one. This is a reconstruction of Northern Hemisphere temperatures over the past 2,000 years. And of course, and it's annual temperatures, by the way. The first thing that pops out is the magnitude of anthropogenic global warming. Right? Until recently anyway, anthropogenic global warming has often been thought of as a threat of the future. Right? And I think now we're increasingly starting to think of it as a present day threat. And you can see why, because it's reached a magnitude that has no parallel really in thousands of years, really over the past 12,000 years. For the whole Holocene geological epoch, basically, climate has not changed as much as it already has since the 19th century. But in this reconstruction, you can also see real variability even before the onset of anthropogenic warming. A period of climatic cooling in the 6th century CE, for example, that some paleoclimatologists have started calling the late antique Little Ice Age. There's still debate over how long it lasted, how cold it really was, and how global it really was. But it was cold, we do know that. And then, of course, more significantly here in this reconstruction, you can see a period of climatic cooling that set in around the 13th century CE and lasted in waves, in a series of waves through the mid to late 19th century. And this is what we call the Little Ice Age. So a late antique Little Ice Age, and then a Little Ice Age proper. In both periods, global temperatures cooled by several tenths of a degree Celsius, Northern Hemisphere temperatures a little more. And in the coldest decades of both periods, maybe even a little bit more than that. So less than global warming so far, but still quite significant. Now, what was the cause? Well, the causes were probably diverse, but the most important were probably stratovolcanic eruptions like this one, explosive volcanoes that released sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which then was chemically converted into dust that spread around the world. And the dust scattered incoming solar radiation and therefore had a relatively short cooling effect that could be lengthened when those clusters of these volcanic eruptions set off various feedbacks in the climate system. So you can see here how this works with the Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991. See all those sulfur dioxide aerosols ejected into the stratosphere and then becoming global. The Mount Pinatubo eruption is the last really huge explosive eruption that cooled the Earth, again in 1991. And this this graph is a little involved, but at the top you can see another reconstruction of annual temperatures, or really growing season temperatures in the northern hemisphere. This time over 2,500 years. The circles represent the coldest years in this period. You see a whole bunch of them around the late Antique Little Ice Age and in periods of the Little Ice Age. And then underneath that, you can see these vertical lines. That represents the amount of sulfur dioxide lofted into the stratosphere, and in turn, the influence of volcanic eruptions on Earth's climate, the cooling influence. So you can see big eruptions closely correspond to these cold periods. Okay, so all of this data, all these reconstructions are the foundation of attempts to connect climate changes to human history, are the foundations of a multidisciplinary field we have recently coined the History of Climate and Society, or HCS. The field, probably the biggest disciplines that are represented in it are archaeology, geography, economics, and history. And this is just a smattering of recent books written by historians, mostly about the Little Ice Age, all of them using climate reconstructions, and almost all of them published in the last 10 years. I should say almost all of them by historians. I think there's one or two of them that are not, strictly speaking, by historians. So this gives you a sense of how dynamic the field is. At this point, we've got over 4,000 publications in this field that we've put up on a bibliography at climatehistory.net. But it's a booming field. And I think that's for two reasons. One, the climate reconstructions keep getting better. So it keeps getting easier to link past climate changes to human history. And number two, as you can imagine, and you all know and are living, there's more and more concern about anthropogenic warming. And it's thought by many that the past gives us some of our best clues as to what will happen in the future. So that kind of corresponds, I think, to this boom. The field is diverse, but I think you can break it into two different schools, I guess, for establishing links between climate changes and human history, establishing causation, in other words. There's a qualitative school that uses what's been called by Sam White and Ting Pei cause of effect methods for establishing causation. And these use traditional historical tools like inferences from historical evidence, comparisons with similar cases, counterfactual reasoning, all this stuff that historians usually do in their scholarship. And what you try and do then, using this method, is establish climate change as a necessary and sufficient condition for social change. So it had to be there, and it caused social change. In specific, and this is important, in specific case studies. So all this kind of work focuses on case studies. So that's a qualitative school. And all those books that I showed you, they're all from that qualitative school. But there's also a more influential school, which I would call the statistical school of HCS scholarship. And here what you do is you take those climate reconstructions. So let's say annual average temperatures in China, which has been a focus for this kind of work. And then you compare them with some sort of element of human history that you can quantify on the same scale. So let's say the annual frequency of wars in central China. So you compare them side by side and try and find correlations between them. And if those correlations are statistically significant, you say that you've established the control of the climate variable over the historical variable. So by doing that, The argument goes, you've established that climate change was a cause of historical change. Let's say climate change is the cause of war, but that doesn't mean it's necessary or sufficient in every instance, in every case study. And as you can see, as you can probably guess, there's quite a bit of conflict between these two schools because they're trying to do fundamentally different things, right? So the people who do the qualitative work will say, hey, statistical people, you haven't established that climate change was a cause in every case study, in our case study. And the people who do statistical work will say, well, no, but that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to do something where we have a different understanding of causation than you do. So it kind of goes back and forth, and there hasn't been much agreement yet as to which standard of causation to use. But there is actually some agreement on the usual kinds of impact that climate changes have had over the last 2,000 years. Both of these schools use very similar models in which climate change is most directly influencing human history by altering what's here called bioproductivity. In other words, by interrupting or shortening growing seasons. And when that happened enough, food prices skyrocketed, the argument goes, in many societies. And from that flow all the other impacts of climate changes, social disturbances, migration, war, epidemics even, through malnutrition and ultimately population decline. The story is really very similar in each one of these studies, or almost all of these studies. This is a model from a qualitative study. Actually, this is one from a statistical study. And it's pretty clear that it's very, very similar. Right? It's called an impact order. So the first order of impacts is, again, growing seasons, bioproductivity, and food shortages that then cause starvation, malnutrition, wars, and so on and so forth. This has also been called a fatal synergy between climate change and all these other terrible things that happen sort of at the same time, the argument goes. And so because of that, because these models are so similar across all of this scholarship, there's been a very, very similar focus on catastrophe in this scholarship. This is a graph we created for a recent article in the journal Nature. And this graph just focuses on the last 20 years of scholarship published by historians on Europe during the Little Ice Age. So a very narrow slice of HCS scholarship. And you can see in gray here, the cumulative articles, it's already about 175 or so articles published just in these 20 years on that very narrow slice. And you can see also that almost all of these articles focus on catastrophe. And I think this is a function of that kind of impact order, at least partly a function of it. So it's all very bad, the history of climate in this scholarship. A lot of the scholarship in the qualitative school actually ends up focusing on case studies, and really a pretty narrow selection of case studies. So Egypt has become a pretty popular topic. The idea goes that volcanically induced droughts brought about the downfall of ancient Egyptian dynasties. The classical Maya, they have produced dozens, at the very least dozens of publications that all focus on how changes in atmospheric circulation created drought on the Yucatan Peninsula that ultimately made it impossible for the Mayans to sustain their cities, which depended on irrigation. Similar arguments have been made for Angkor, that this hydraulic civilization could not endure similar changes in atmospheric circulation that brought drought during the Little Ice Age. And then maybe the most famous example has to do with the fewest people, settlements created by the Norse on the western coast of Greenland that disappeared soon after the regional onset of the Little Ice Age. The argument goes that subsistence strategies brought from Europe to Greenland could not endure climatic cooling, although this argument really has been nuanced a great deal in recent scholarship. Some people tried to put it all together. A historian called Geoffrey Parker argued that during the coldest half century or so of the Little Ice Age, there were more simultaneous revolts and revolutions than ever before or since, owing to these reductions in food availability and increases in the cost of food that were created by climatic cooling and to some extent droughts as well. In fact, those changes were so severe Geoffrey Parker argues that you can see it in the recorded height of French men, which you can see at the bottom right here. The height seems to have gone down during cold phases of the Little Ice Age because there wasn't enough food to go around for children. So they were stunted and didn't grow as much. Right? So this is kind of the character of the field, again, of these thousands of publications so far. I started to become a little bit skeptical of some of this while writing The Frigid Golden Age. And thank you for the compliment, Dr. Herman. But this is a book that, basically what I tried to do with this book is to say, hey, the climate change, the impact of climatic cooling during the Little Ice Age on one society, the Dutch Republic, precursor of the present day Netherlands, those impacts were complicated. You can't just say that they were disastrous, although they were that too. There are also many ways in which this society was able to be resilient. I'll go over that definition in a couple minutes, but was able to benefit from aspects of the Little Ice Age. And I could see that by turning my focus away from political strife, which has been kind of the focus of people like Geoffrey Parker, and towards economic developments, cultural developments, and even how wars were fought. And so this is how I started to become a little bit suspicious of this focus in my field, in HCS. And from that, ultimately came this article that I collaborated with and that was recently published in Nature, where we identify a whole bunch of systemic shortcomings in how people have examined the past. Many of them having to do with how evidence has been used. And it was actually kind of stunning that we were able to identify this so consistently in so much scholarship, and that we were able to identify that we'd fallen into these traps actually ourselves as well in kind of work that we have done. So we found many instances of climate data being used inappropriately, or the wrong kind of data used, or used selectively or misinterpreted, an excessive focus on really big scales of analysis, the rise and fall of empires, just like Ellsworth Huntington, right? Not really paying attention to the local levels on which people actually respond to and understand climate changes. We saw many examples of historical primary sources being taken at face value, which a historian would normally never do. And some cognitive biases, like something that's called the McNamara fallacy, which I found quite interesting, dates back from the Vietnam War, when our Department of Defense here in Washington, DC, figured that it was winning every battle and therefore winning the war because numerically it was killing more soldiers than it lost. Well, it wasn't taking into account what couldn't be quantified. And this is something that statistical scholars have done a lot in HCS scholarship. And they've also fallen victim to what's called the streetlight effect, where you only use data that's easily accessible to you. It doesn't mean that data is all that exists, right? So this has been a common shortcoming as well. And in general, there's been way too much focus on agrarian empires and on those impacts of climate change on food, which has led to obsessive focus with disaster. And I guess there's been far too little attention to uncertainty. As you can imagine, it's really hard to connect climate changes to human responses, even now, right? That turns out to be exceptionally difficult to do. Imagine doing that for sparsely documented societies hundreds of years ago, right? It's very difficult to try and make those connections. And if you do, you really have to clearly articulate what kinds of uncertainties still exist in your analyses. And people just haven't done that. So we developed a framework, a basic framework, not only actually for more accurately connecting past climate changes and more convincingly connecting past climate changes to human history, but I think it has, the more I think about it, I think it has broader applicability as well. A framework for connecting climate changes to social responses even now. It consists of a whole bunch of questions that you have to ask, we argue, in order to make these connections. And a lot of those questions come down to, hey, am I asking specialists on, for example, climate, what the climate is actually doing? Believe it or not, that is a sort of a rare thing to do. Or am I figuring out what's actually happening at the local level? Am I talking to specialists on local environments and figuring out what's happening there? Not just kind of assuming that because climate change is roughly are associated with societal changes, they're connected. Right? There's that local environmental level that's often ignored. When I look at society, am I taking into account other possible causes for the social changes that I've identified? Am I really creating hypotheses that are attuned to the limitations of my sources, using the right statistical methods that are also attuned to those sources, and acknowledging uncertainties? All that stuff turns out to be, frankly, quite rare when people make these kinds of connections for the past or even for the present, answering all of these questions. And frankly, again, I'm not saying that we've been perfect at all. We've fallen victim to a lot of the problems, myself included, that we identify in this work. And so we've got a whole sections that I'm not showing you here, where we explain how we've fallen into those problems ourselves. Okay, so we use that framework and then scour the globe, especially Europe, which has been a focus for historical scholarship on the Little Ice Age, to find examples of populations that maybe responded in diverse ways, more diverse ways, to both the late antique Little Ice Age and the Little Ice Age. And by doing that, we really ended up focusing again on resilience, which, and we're using here the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition for resilience, the ability of societies to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure. And in our analysis, adaptation is sort of a subset of resilience that really focuses more, that emphasizes more adjustments to climate changes and exploiting potentially beneficial opportunities that climate changes could create in regional environments in the past. So these are our definitions that we work with, and then we found 5 different pathways by which past populations could demonstrate resilience. So the exploitation of new opportunities in regional environments, the use or the development of energy systems that could be resilient to changes in temperature or precipitation, the use of diverse resources through trade or even through empire, so that when climate changes reduce the availability of one resource, other resources were still available. The creation of political institutions and structures that could respond to climatic shocks, so that the second time a climatic shock came round, the institution was better able to adapt. And then finally, migration, which Dr. Herman knows more about than I do, frankly. Migration as a means of transforming a society while still having those kinds of essential features that made up the society in the first place. Right, so we stress these 5 pathways, although we do say that these are not comprehensive. They're just the pathways that we found in our case studies. Nor are they, I should emphasize, necessarily good, right? Sometimes resilience is framed as something that is necessarily good, but that is not always the case, because resilience and adaptation can be vehicles for inequality as well, right? So I mentioned resources of trade and empire. Right? So sometimes resilience could come at the expense, or I should say resilience for one population could come at the expense of another. But anyway, so yeah, that's what we emphasize. And to give you a sense of these case studies, we find, for example, that in South Central Africa, at top left, we use linguistic evidence to find that populations migrated during periods of drying and during periods of increased precipitation to take advantage of new resources. In the Mojave, at the bottom left, we found evidence of more sophisticated storage structures and increased trade during an erratic, unpredictable climate in the late 16th century CE. And around the Svalbard archipelago, that was one of my case studies, I focused on the response of whalers to climatic cooling. And since I think we have a minute or two, I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Here you can see Svalbard. It's roughly between Norway and the North Pole. All of you Arctic experts probably already know that, but most of my audiences do not. And there was a whaling industry that developed around Svalbard in the early 17th century and around the island of Jan Mayen to the west, which you can see at the bottom right here. That whaling industry became truly enormous. It ended up involving about 10,000 whalers and nearly extirpating a population of bowhead whales that numbered about 50,000, maybe as many as 100,000 at the beginning of the 17th century. Now, the whaling industry depended enormously on sea ice. At the left here, you can see sea ice around the archipelago of Svalbard roughly 10 years ago. And on the right, you can see a picture taken by Bathsheba Demuth, another colleague of the area around Svalbard here with sea ice in plentiful supply. At the beginning of the Greenland fishery, whalers would whale from the coast. This is when it was a little bit warmer, and it would be later on in the 17th century. So they were able to access the coast for most of the summer and use techniques of boiling blubber on the coast. So they would hunt individual whales, flens the whales, strip them of blubber, and boil that blubber on the coast, converting it into oil, which they then shipped back to Europe. Later on in the 17th century, it got a little bit warmer still, and huge whaling companies set up permanent whaling stations on the coasts of Jan Mayen and Svalbard to boil the blubber on an industrial scale. But later in the 17th century, it cooled dramatically. And now sea ice kept whalers from accessing their coastal whaling stations for much of the summer. But instead of the whaling industry collapsing, it actually boomed because individual whalers sort of thrust off the yoke of the monopoly whaling companies and figured out how to whale at sea, either by boiling blubbers on their ship, which was dangerous, or by cutting up the blubber and actually transporting it home where it could be boiled in greater purity. So rather than the whaling industry collapsing, it actually expanded at a tremendous cost, of course, to bowhead whales, but also creating tremendous profits for small whaling companies and mercantile European nations. Okay, so the question is, in our article and a lot of my work, what can we learn from this? This is a representation of Earth in 2100, according to what we call a relatively moderate emission scenario. So an emission scenario that calculates that we release about as much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere as we are most likely to, according to present day commitments, a world that is about 2.5, maybe 3 degrees Celsius hotter than it is now. So as you can see, a profoundly different world, particularly in the Arctic. Okay, so what can we learn? Well, from our work in nature, which is what I'll focus on for now, we learn, first of all, that the past does not tell us that we are doomed, I think. We might be. It's possible. We're not ruling it out completely. But often in popular literature in particular, you see the past used as evidence for our inability to cope with climate change. Past populations have collapsed in the face of climate change. We inevitably will as well. Well, I think that if we learn that from the past, it's because the field of HCS has been problematic in the ways that I've identified. So really the lessons of the past are more diverse, if you ask me. One of those lessons is that adaptation, at least to relatively moderate climate changes, is possible and is urgently needed. Those populations that coped with past climate change seem to have changed, seem to have adapted to those climate changes. And adaptation, of course, again, Dr. Herman knows this probably better than me, adaptation is not nearly as developed enough as it ought to be, I would say. Especially in the United States, but elsewhere as well. So we need to adapt. But I think the study also reveals that if we adapt, well, adaptation can be, again, a vehicle for social economic inequality. It can exacerbate inequality. And so environmental justice has to be baked into adaptation from the ground floor in the United States and elsewhere. And then finally, I think we have created a basic framework that encourages us to be a little bit more cautious in connecting climate changes to human responses even today. You may all have heard of this argument that climate changes were responsible, or climate change was responsible for the Syrian civil war. Drought created migration, which then fueled unrest in the outskirts of Syrian cities. That argument goes. Well, it now seems likely that most of the migration that happened was not due to climate change, and that the sort of places that erupted against the Assad regime were not the places that received most of this migration. And so detailed local work, interdisciplinary local work, has undermined those conclusions. And so we have to be kind of careful in connecting present-day climate changes to human responses, because sometimes we can end up serving, in my opinion, pretty nefarious political ends. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. That was, I think, a whirlwind tour of a field that maybe many of our participants have a little less firsthand knowledge of, and some really big concrete takeaways for things to think about. So before we get into our questions, if everyone could join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. I can hear it is thunderous across the world, even if we cannot hear it on Zoom. I am very confident that there is a lot of applause. We have many questions that have come in already, and as a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat so I can bring you onto the screen to ask, or ask on your behalf. So our first question, I'm going to ask Dimitris, do you want to come on and kick us off?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, and in general, like for mentioning climate adaptation as a concept, because nowadays it's considered like a bad phrase to use, because like everybody's like only for climate mitigation and stuff, but I mean climate change is coming, so we need to adapt. And yeah, my question was mostly when I saw the figure that you've shown with like the temperatures that go throughout history. So there was like the little ice age, and there was like some explanation of it with like volcanic eruptions and all. But before that, there was, I was sensing like some kind of pattern going from like colder temperatures to warmer, and then again the same. So is there like some explanation for that? This is my first question. And the second question, was this pattern considered the norm before the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, these are the questions.
Yeah, those are really great questions, and no, it's prompted an enormous amount of discourse and scholarship, of course, those terms adaptation and resilience, and that's really something that we wrestled with a lot in this article, whether to use those terms. They can be very problematic for political reasons. We ended up doing that, but clearly defining it in our article. And I know this wasn't your question, but I'll get to your question in just a second, because this is really something that we wrestled with, right? We ended up using the IPCC definitions because they are so accessible. And I think because they allow us to speak directly to present day debates about what to do now. But we did actually also emphasize some problems with those terms if you do read, if you want to read the article. There's another, kind of getting off track now a little bit, but there is a group at the University of Texas that's now working towards a new definition of resilience and adaptation. That should be really interesting project to follow. But anyway, about your question, yeah, so before the Little Ice Age, there was a period of controversial and very modest warming called the medieval climate anomaly. It used to be called the medieval warm period. And it was coined by someone called Hubert Lamb back, I think, in the 1960s, who did exactly what we criticized, took primary sources at face value, European primary sources. Primary source, if you're not in history, doesn't always necessarily doesn't seem obvious, but primary sources are usually texts that were written by people at the time. So documents written by people at the time. And they might include, let's say, weather observations or observations about activities that must have been directly influenced by weather, like harvest dates. So he took all of these sources at face value, and he argued that the medieval centuries were much warmer than the mid-20th century when he was writing. So this was called the medieval warm period. And subsequently, scholars have found, well, you know, if we use these archives of nature and these archives of society, we don't see a really extreme medieval medieval warm period at all. And so that's when that term, medieval climate anomaly, was coined. If there was warmth, it was located primarily around Europe and maybe around Eastern North America. And this is another reason why Hubert Lamb kind of messed up, because he was using primarily European sources. So that's partly where that comes from. Globally, it was not as cold, however, as it would be later during the Little Ice Age. And that can be for two different reasons, at least, maybe three. One of those reasons is that there were just not as many explosive volcanic eruptions during these centuries. I think that boils down to random chance. Another is that a really big thing that I didn't talk about as something that causes climate change, that's called forces climate change, is just internal variability in the climate system. This is a really complex system that sort of changes of its own accord. So you get these fluctuations in temperature that could be not insignificant, that didn't need any sort of external shock at all. So, and that is actually a pretty consistent feature of the climate system. In fact, a very consistent feature of the climate system, those kinds of variability. Now, over a longer time period, you know, I mentioned, I think, briefly the Holocene geological epoch, which we are currently in, arguably, unless you want to say that we're in Anthropocene. That is a period of relatively stable climate. It's actually defined by being a period of relatively stable climate in between what's colloquially called ice ages, glacial maxima. And so the variability in climate that you see over these thousands of years is not nearly as big as what you would see in the Pleistocene, which preceded the Holocene, where temperatures really could swing enormously on, you know, the same magnitude as some of the more extreme global warming predictions over the space of decades. So we've been very fortunate to be in the Holocene. Our whole civilization, at least sedentary civilizations, developed in the Holocene. And that's why it's pretty stupid that we're doing what we're doing. Put it that way. But hopefully that answers most of your questions. I don't want to go on for too long here.
It does actually, thank you, and yeah, like for the suggestion to check the resilience hub in the in the University of Texas, like in the university that I'm in, we have also like a resilience lab. But yeah, like I was asking because there was like this notion of because I have been doing research, like helping with research there, and there has been this notion with climate adaptation, not using the term and everything. But yeah. Thank you very much.
Just to quickly, very, very quickly get into that. And I'm sure you already know this actually, but I'll just say it anyway. The biggest criticisms of these terms, resilience and adaptation, right, is that if you focus too much on the adaptation, you reduce focus on mitigation, and that's just reducing. Mitigation refers to reducing emissions, and so, you know, and it's legitimate. Adaptation has been used by the fossil fuel industry and you know, skeptics of a certain kind to try and undermine support for climate action, right? So that is one of the main criticisms of that concept, and there are others too, but I don't want to get into it too much.
Yeah, we could have a robust discussion on climate terminology and its implications for investment, responsibility, and policy, which maybe we will in our discussion session after this. We have a few other questions that have come in. One is from Sierra, who would like to know, since climate change drives people to migrate, how do you see the climate migration nexus unfolding in the Arctic? Are there any social archives, as you refer to them, that hold clues?
Yeah, so there has been actually quite a bit of scholarship on migration in the Arctic. And social archives that have been used for that include oral histories. That's been a very important one, and archaeological evidence. I don't think any linguistic evidence has been collected, although that would actually be really interesting. And so I think that has been the major focus there. There's a scholar, I believe her name is Julie Cruikshank, although I might be wrong about that, who has written actually a book specifically on indigenous responses to climate change in the Arctic, that might be of interest. Blanking on the title right now, but it has glacier in it. Do glaciers cry? It might be that. But that might be worth checking out. In terms of what the past can tell us about the future of migration in the Arctic, I think that becomes very difficult because climate changes in the Arctic will be so extraordinarily extreme, right? And that is something that is worth emphasizing as well. When you look at the past, it might be a good guide to the future, but it's a very imperfect guide, because when we're thinking about the little ice age, right, we are really thinking about temperature changes of several tenths of a degree Celsius globally. And if we do everything right, if we're super lucky, we're going to get up to warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. More likely, my guess would be around 2 or just north of 2 degrees Celsius, right? So you can see a radically different magnitude, but that of course obscures at different magnitudes, different latitudes, and in different regions. And so the Arctic is going to change so fundamentally that it's really hard to think of historical parallels. One thing we do know is that in the past, indigenous populations have been remarkably resilient and adaptive in the face of climate changes of a different sort, of a different magnitude. And I said of a different magnitude, but maybe that's not even entirely correct. Do Glaciers Listen? Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the right book. Of a different magnitude in the period of time that I cover. Not of a different magnitude in the Pleistocene. And there's actually been a lot of interesting archaeological work about how populations endured the Younger Dryas, for example, a period of really extreme cooling. Again, maybe more extreme in magnitude than anything we will face in the coming centuries, where sometimes you can see populations remaining in one place in spite of radically different abilities to collect resources. Resource distribution radically changes. And these are gatherer-hunter or hunter-gatherer communities in the far north. So, what limited evidence we have shows a remarkable capacity for adaptation historically. But again, the changes of the future are going to be so different in character. And all of these changes are happening in the broader context of other environmental pressures, which we collectively call the Anthropocene, that I don't want to say too much that will predict what will happen in the future, I guess. It's a little bit up in the air.
Also, many pathways to further research for those of you who are looking for projects, theses, questions to answer. There is no shortage of questions to answer here.
Actually, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
And this will probably surprise no one, but the characterization of indigenous responses to climate change, particularly in the Americas, has really changed over the last maybe decade or so. Whereas before, the emphasis was really on examples of collapse. Jared Diamond's Collapse is probably the best example. This is one of the most popular books in environmental scholarship, right? And so these I mentioned the Mayans, right? These kinds of examples keep coming up or kept coming up in this field. But now there's really been a change towards focusing on indigenous polities, indigenous populations, nations, as being resilient in the face of climate change, as really understanding their diverse and complex strategies for adapting to the opportunities that climate changes could bring in the past couple thousand years, or even beyond that. So this has been, what I want to emphasize, I guess, is that this has been a key change in HCS scholarship, but this change is really only in its infancy, if you ask me. And so there's a lot more work that can and should be done, in my opinion.
So we have quite a lot of questions, but I'm actually going to pull to the front because I think they directly relate to what you just said. So Griffith says that you already answered his. I was going to ask him to read it. It's about resilience, which I think actually would be worthwhile to answer. because you somewhat answered it, but I think more could be said on the term resilience. So Griffith asks, regarding resilience, how do you separate resilience at the individual level from societal structures? Much research seems to focus on the lack of resilience of empires, including indigenous ones, whereas indigenous groups are often held up as an example of resilience. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's probably more to say on that.
Yeah. So I actually think that a good amount of research tends to focus on the societal level, I guess, in HCS, so societal vulnerability, but then frankly also societal resilience. And what's often missed, and Tim Sooms has written about this, I think his article that he wrote was called Resilient Societies, Vulnerable People. What can be missed, you could criticize my work for this a little bit as well, I think, is how resilience of institutions and structures can belie the vulnerability of people, often marginalized people within society. So this is something that we try to emphasize in some of our media work surrounding this Nature article and some of my other work. I don't think there's been nearly enough scholarship that thinks at a much more complicated level about populations, about societies, right? Where you could have pockets of resilience and vulnerability within the same societies, maybe because there's resilience, there's also vulnerability, right? Maybe the resilience is compounding that vulnerability. So that kind of thinks at a level of analysis that is both narrower than and broader than the societal level. So I think that is another area where there's got to be a lot more work done. As you can imagine, that can be more difficult when you're thinking deep into the past, where your sources might be more limited. But that doesn't make it impossible. If you alter the kinds of sources that you use, work in more transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary groups where you can use, again, different kinds of sources and evaluate them in different ways. Historical linguistics being a great example of this. I think our articles was one of the first that ever used that source because we were one of the first groups to ever include a historical linguist, which is why we were able to write about South Central Africa, right? So there's a lot more work that can be done with more diverse and creative use of sources. How do you separate resilience, though, is actually quite interesting. And I'm not claiming I have all the answers for this. I think, I think it just depends on your sort of unit of analysis and the kinds of sources that you use, right? Those populations who were resilient, they can be accessed. There's non-societal structures, but populations, they can be accessed using different collections of sources. And so it's just a matter of altering the structure of your research project to take that into account. Let's see. There's another aspect of this here that I find really interesting. The research seems to focus on the lack of resilience of empires, whereas indigenous groups are held up as examples of resilience. Again, I think what the research seems to focus on when it comes specifically to indigenous histories is the lack of resilience, and this is from the scholarship that I've read in the last few years, the lack of resilience of empires, of polities that used particular kinds of subsistence strategies and particular kinds of infrastructure. So if they use a lot of sort of complex built infrastructure, some scholarship argues they were more vulnerable, where if they use more flexible subsistence strategies, they were less vulnerable. I'm skeptical of some of that scholarship, to be honest, but that is how I would tentatively sort of characterize the shape of the scholarship where it stands right now.
Yeah, a lot to think about, but also a lot of exciting, I think, expansion that can happen in that research. Arina, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, so sorry, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. It was really, really cool. My question draws upon previous questions as well, and I'll just kind of ask the part that I think wasn't really asked. During your research, did you notice any significant changes when it came to high Arctic indigenous societies, like the way they built their societies and the materials that they use for construction?
I wish I could say yes, and there is work on this actually. It's work that spans huge differences in time frames and very different methodologies and disciplines as well. So I actually know a doctoral student who's working on the built environment of the Arctic right now and how it's responded to climate change, including indigenous responses to climate change. And she's doing architecture. She's doing a PhD in architecture at MIT, I believe, which is super cool. And so that's just one example of the kind of research that's being done. There's also plenty of research in anthropology and archaeology that explores these changes. But I will say, Arena, to be completely honest with you, I am no expert on that scholarship. So I don't want to, mischaracterize it. But it's, I will say it's a thriving and diverse scholarship for sure. Again, focusing not only on recent changes, but also going very far back into the past. And actually, I want to just touch on this briefly because Suzanne asked what is driving this change. I think I've talked now a little bit on how there's more focus on diverse, flexible indigenous responses to climate changes. And I think there's a few different things that are driving that. One is a diversification of the field and on climate scholarship and discourse activism as well, more broadly, right? This used to be, HCS used to be a very white, male, old field. And that's, I think, increasingly not the case anymore. And I think that reflects changes in climate scholarship more broadly, which are too slow, but are happening, and climate activism for that matter as well. So I think that's part of it. I would also say that, again, I mentioned those reconstructions getting better and better, right? Better reconstructions usually means higher resolution, meaning more precise. And also not just higher resolution, but integrated into model simulations called model hindcasts, so the same computer models that you can use to predict the future, you can use to simulate the past. So you're getting more and more data about far more parts of the globe at a much greater precision, which means you're not necessarily as reliant on some of those archives of society or those tree ring reconstructions, which might be found only in some pockets of the earth, like China, like Europe, like India, etc. So now you're able to explore more broadly. And I think that's driving part of the change too. And there's some other stuff too, but again, I don't want to go on and on and on. But so it's changing for diverse reasons. Yeah.
Well, I think from some people's comments, they would be happy to listen to you all day, although I'm not sure you would be happy to spend all day on Zoom.
My kids will not let me.
So we have, I think, one question left that has not been answered yet, but if anyone has any final questions, please put them in the chat so we can make sure to answer them. But our final question coming in comes from Kalia. Would you like to come on and ask yours?
Sure. So my question was basically about, I read the blog post about the whaling in outside of Norway. And I was wondering about the use of the term Holocene over Anthropocene, because from most of the scholarship I interact with and read, we really only use Anthropocene at this point. So I was just kind of wondering if that's because you're coming from a more science-based side where there's disagreement among, the start date and all the details of Anthropocene, or what the kind of reasoning behind that word choice was.
Sure, yeah. Well, I have to confess, first of all, that I usually use the term Anthropocene, and I teach classes on the Anthropocene, courses on the Anthropocene. So I do like that term. It has a few problems, however. I'll begin with that, and then maybe talk about the Holocene a little bit too. For the purpose of using it, one of the problems, if you're talking more in a scientific context, and really, if you're trying to be more interdisciplinary, which means combining, you know, right, history, geography, anthropology, paleoscience, a whole bunch of these different disciplines, is that the term Anthropocene has not been formally accepted yet by geologists, right? And there's an extent to which that doesn't matter, right? It's entered popular lingo, it's used in many different disciplines outside of the sciences, but as a geological epoch, it is not technically yet a thing. It probably will be accepted as a thing, but technically it is not yet. At least that's the last time I checked. So for that reason, if you're talking to geologists, if you're talking to scientists, that can be a little bit tricky to use, I'll put it that way. Other thing is that the Anthropocene as a concept can be problematic for a lot of people because I mean, the implication is that humanity is to blame for the transformation, destruction of the Earth system, or the ongoing transformation and destruction of the Earth system, if you want to define the Anthropocene that way, rather than, you know, it doesn't acknowledge that large portions of humanity have not been responsible for that, or are less responsible for that. So people have proposed terms like the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene, even the Pyrocene, because the suggestion is that the Anthropocene gives us too much confidence in our own supremacy. And the Pyrocene suggests the future of increased wildfires and climate catastrophe. Even though, to be honest, wildfires are not fated to become more devastating or more extensive in even a warmer climate. That's my criticism of that term. But so there's been a lot of controversy, I guess, about the Anthropocene as well. I still prefer to use it, actually. So in general, I prefer to use it. In a specific climate context, Holocene does have its uses even beyond thinking in a transdisciplinary way, because the Holocene really draws attention to the long-term stability, relatively speaking, of the climate, which we are now breaking, basically, right? And yeah, the break is associated with the Anthropocene, but by using that word, you kind of emphasize how we are smashing this climate state that has worked quite well for us for a long time. So yeah, could also, of course, have been that I made a mistake in my article. That is always very possible.
But some sound reasoning that you provided. And also, if you did make a mistake, there's always room for discussion. That is the joy of academia.
Yes, it really is. Mistakes are usually okay.
Right, we have one final question. Suzanne, I'm going to ask you to ask yours to finish off a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Victoria. Thank you so much for this talk. And also thanks to, I see the comments coming in with articles that are super interesting. I really like Zoe Todd. Thanks, Kalia. The question that I have is, when you talked about the changing narrative in your field, where it's more foregrounding Indigenous resilience, one concern that I do have is the degree to which this is more lip service. You know, there's the whole emerging trend towards multiple ontologies and how we should be embracing talking across worldviews and really prioritizing Indigenous worldviews and taking it seriously for a change. But at the same time, there's also this concern that, you know, is it because we've run out of other avenues to explore? Is it because it's more lip service? And I would be really interested to understand more about the actual Indigenous scholarship in the field and whose voices are these?
Yeah, well, that's a huge problem, I think, in Arctic scholarship, and not just in Arctic scholarship, in environmental scholarship, right? And still, often what you'll see is sort of researchers parachuting into these topics and into Indigenous Inuit, for example, communities, and kind of extracting, right? And then creating articles based on that extraction. I think that's, frankly, I think that's still a problem in HCS scholarship. So I don't want to sort of brush that away. I do think that there are more Indigenous voices now in the field, but not nearly enough. I mean, it still has a diversity issue, frankly. And frankly, it's been well documented now. There's been a lot of articles written about that, but I think that is also the case in environmental and climate scholarship and activism more broadly. There's still a lot more to be done. So I think it's a fair criticism actually that some of this has to do with lip service without listening to indigenous voices, but not all of it. I would also stress that that it's more complex than that, or it's more, maybe the picture is a little bit more hopeful than that. So I guess I would say mostly it's a fair criticism. And Zoe Todd has done a lot of really important work on some of these themes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair criticism, and maybe something we could discuss with a few of our speakers later in this college that I think are going to focus a bit more on decolonizing some parts of Arctic academia. So look forward to that discussion as we end our program a little bit later this spring. But for now, I'm going to again ask everyone to give a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for a totally awesome presentation, and I think a really meaningful question and answer. There was so many questions, and I really appreciate you answering all of them. And to everyone else who has been sharing these articles, I am copying and pasting them. So know that in my follow-up email today, you'll also get all of these links if you've missed any, because this is clearly an area that everyone is eager to learn more about. So thank you for jumpstarting this discussion for us.
Hey, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed the questions too. I would also flag the work of Bathsheba Demuth, who does incorporate, the worldviews and knowledge of science and indigenous worldviews in her work. So that's a really interesting example of how this kind of knowledge can be integrated and worked with. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I will flag that we actually had Dr. Demuth present way back in January in the Arctic Winter College, that I will also share her talk, because I think that was an interesting one. And
January feels like it was about 10 years ago, doesn't it?
It was 10 years ago. It's a very long time ago. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you spending more time on Zoom and getting to ask and answer all of our pressing questions. So thank you.
More time on Zoom is always fun. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye. All right, so hold tight, everyone.